Thank you so much. It is a really great honor to be here. I still remember 2 years ago how incredible it was to be here. Had some of the best questions I've ever had. So I expect you to stay up to that high standard. So Erwin was so kind to ask me to talk about soil health, legumes, participatory action research. I've taken out a lot of legume slides. There'll still be a lot left because I was so honored to get to see Ken Giller and Roland Bunch, people I've admired all my life, tried to learn from, already covered everything about legumes, so we're good. So we all know the sustainability challenges. Some farmers in particular really struggle to produce maize. And there's some sobering notes. One of my students, Placid and Pekatula in Malawi, has recently shown that unfortunately things keep going down. Things don't stay the same. Things seemed challenging when I came to Malawi in 1993. Unfortunately, farmers are struggling with the fact that, in fact, the soils, when we compare to when they were measured in 1990, in areas where there's intensive cultivation, we know when we first plow the ground to grow crops in former Miamba woodland, of course, soil organic matter, about half is lost. But unfortunately, it seems like we're still going down a little bit, so that's quite scary. So we need to think again about soil health. And also I'm going to talk about legume diversity, because I can't help myself, and future pulses, and you might see a pigeon pea or two. So just a quick review. I think many of you know how important soil organic matter is to soil health. It's the foundation. In fact, if soils are too sandy, how do we ameliorate them? We improve them through building soil organic matter. But if they're too clay and they're flooding and they're getting saturation problems, then again we use soil organic matter. So it's always there as the foundation. But it's important to remember not all soil organic matter is the same. In fact, there's so much of it there. Even 1% organic matter means there's a huge amount in a meter of soil, right, in that profile. So it's hard to detect changes. We can work and work on it, but there's so much there in the background that it's hard to pick up a difference. But luckily, this active pot is what provides the nitrogen and many other nutrients for crops, and a lot of times aggregation, things that we need for producing crops, is somewhat a smaller part, and we have ways now to start to measure that. So it's important to remember that this stable part that we have from thousands of years depends on the type of soil texture you have, and then we have sort of an in-between, and then we have the recent stuff. So we can change soil organic matter, is the bottom line. So how do we build it? Well, we know that legumes often seem to decompose very fast. So you might think, I was told back when I was learning about soils, that legumes are not the way to build organic matter. You have to use things like grasses and find roots from grasses. But it turns out legume roots play a special role, and I'm going to show you that. So it does matter the quantity. Biomass, as we've heard several times here today, that as you put more biomass, you get more soil organic matter. So that's good. But it's not as simple as that. We know when we've grown a lot of corn, it produces lots of residues, but we don't always build organic matter. And that's partly because quality matters too, because of the microbes. Now, many of us love corn. Sometimes we're called the people of the corn in North America, as well as Central America, and South America, even Malawi. So we love corn, but if you just have one type of sugar, types of nutrients from one source, like corn, then that maize supports a simplified type of microbes in your gut, right? You just one type of food, you tend to promote one type, or just a few numbers of microbes. But if we have a diverse diet, then in fact, we can get really diverse microorganisms. And the fungi and the bacteria, all the different organisms that we feed with that diversity in the soil or in your gut, will then help build aggregates. The hyphae are very good at sticking everything together. The bacteria produce a slime that helps stick it together more. So together, the combined diverse microbes give us this aggregate, and in the middle of that is OM, organic matter. So it's like a sandwich. So the microbes provide this service, but we have to feed them. And that's mostly through plants and manures. So, yeah, it was like 5 slides before I got to pigeon pea, right? So, it turns out, if you want to build aggregates, that in fact, from our work in Malawi, Johan Six and his students came and did measurements there, and we found that, yes, maize residues so if you can't see a lot in the bulk soil, as I said, the soil, just as a composite, the whole bulk, it's hard to see differences. But when we start to look at the aggregates, then we start to see that pigeon pea will start to improve the nitrogen that's in those aggregates, and even the phosphorus. So when we add fertilizers, when we add manure, we want to get the best bang for our buck. And this is one way, to grow a legume that then recycles that nutrient and makes it available to things like maize, and also builds these organic matter. So, recent study that kind of reviewed many different research studies sort of provides some real evidence of this. When we trace those carbon atoms, we find that maize roots, yes, they build organic matter, so that soil carbon sequestration means building stable organic matter, but only about a third of them. That you add all that biomass, and only about a third of it builds organic matter. While all these legumes, and these are difficult studies to do, so we don't yet have pigeon pea and others, but we do see that legumes, there's a trend towards half or more of that carbon. So you don't get as much, because legumes are smaller generally, except for perennials, than maize, but they're not as leafy. But what they have, especially their roots, even up to 80%. So all the carbon you're adding with legumes is building organic matter. So that's pretty exciting, because we also know they provide nitrogen along the way. So we need to be doing more measurements, like of pigeon pea, to see how much roots are there. And I'll come back to this because it really depends on your soil type. It's hard to grow something in very poor soil, so that's one of our big challenges. But they are there, and we shouldn't forget, if we use the fodder, the biomass for fodder, if we eat it, it's still, there is something there. And those roots are building organic matter. So it's an encouraging note. At the same time, it does take a long time. And something like agroforestry, Gliricidia and Trophosia, medium term, like about a 15-year study, Tracy Beatty showed that it was only a very small, about 15% increase in organic matter. So it does take a long time if you look at the total organic matter to see differences. So don't be discouraged if you measure your soil every so often at your sites and find that there's not much change. It'll take time if you look at total organic matter. But agroforestry systems give us that eventually, and also some nitrogen. But unfortunately, I've been promoting and looking at agroforestry systems, very practical ones that weren't high labor, for many years. And I've only seen them adopted in kind of small show areas or gardens. So they're important there, as living fences and so on, as I'm sure you've seen, but they don't really seem to be taken up in big fields. And I'd be happy to prove it wrong, but I haven't seen it. And I think it's because of all the labor and the timeliness of the labor. It's very difficult if you have to prune something 3 times in a year, right? And right when you're sick or something. So, in fact, there's problems with agroforestry. On the other hand, there is some intercrops, like lab here, and pigeon pea, of course, with maize, that provide food and cash income. So that can be quite quickly taken up, relatively. Also, one thing exciting is that we looked at, with Wilfred Mariki and Neil Miller, they set up this nice trial where they looked at over 30 different varieties or accessions of lab. So it's really wonderful. You can see the genetic variation. But time and time again, if you want to look at nitrogen fixation, the good news is if you grow it as an intercrop, percentage is very high. This year was a drought, not so much, but in every other year, it didn't matter what variety you grew, 80% or so nitrogen fixation occurred if you grew it next to a maize plant. And it makes sense. The maize is grabbing the nitrogen, so what does a legume do? It takes from the atmosphere, because it can do that with its rhizobium partner. So intercrops have certain advantages. Now the total amount of nitrogen fixed would be higher if they did a sole crop, but the percentage is very good. And one of my take-homes today is that not all legumes are alike, and we need them for different purposes. So we really need things like common bean for food, for income. Perennials provide unique soil fertility and organic matter services, but as I said, are difficult to get adoption unless you're a forage system.
What's that perennial?
So we have several here. We have a Trophosia and Gliricidia and a pumpkin, so it's a really mixed system, and maize, obviously. So I wanted to come back to what's been raised at this conference, like, are groundnuts useful? And again, it depends on the variety, how leafy it is. It depends on how you grow it. A doubled up row, so in Malawi they use a ridge system, which leaves a lot of bare soil. But if you do a doubled row of seed, if you're willing to invest that much seed, and you're maybe a market-linked farmer, and you can really invest in that good seed and fertility, you can really get a lot of biomass from, and a lot of nitrogen fixation and even organic matter. So the next year you can see that in the maize response to fertilizer, it goes way up. So in fact, we really do recommend that for farmers that can afford and are linked to markets, right? Because they particularly have that ability to do that. But we also need to think about every time you take off a lot of yield, so the shorter duration groundnuts, so soybeans, this is actually built on, in 1995, Ken Giller and Kaddish produced a paper that really pointed out this very simple trade-off. Gliricidium, these types of fodder labs, they don't have high yields generally, but they give you a lot of nutrients. So there's an intrinsic trade-off in terms of, I think we need both types out there. But if you grow something that has a lot of leafy biomass, it's probably lower yielding unless you can grow it for multiple years. So I'm very excited about multi-pulses is what I call them, these sort of long duration, long-lived types, and I look forward to hearing from you, ones that you've tried. I know these very long duration cowpeas would be another example. Pigeon pea is an example I'm using here. So they provide some food, but also some of these benefits. So there's not just pigeon pea. There is climbing bean, and I took out a lot of slides of climbing bean because it's been talked about a lot. And it's only for really cooler areas, and you have to have a lot of fertility, manure or fertile soil or fertilizer. So it does triple yields. So farmers are adopting it. Runner bean, also cold adapted. Lab, so again, not tolerant of super sandy soils generally, but certainly can be very productive. And we've seen that recently in Tanzania. It's very exciting. So I kind of tried to summarize these. I may be wrong, but this is based on literature and on my own experience and talking to others. So for hotter places, we have some multi-pulses, pigeon pea, lab, mucuna. In some places, that's really neat for fodder. Some parts of Malawi still do eat the grain, although we don't recommend that. Multi-pulses for cool areas. Again, the climbing bean, runner bean. You know, long duration cowpea, we need to try and see, does it fit in here? So there's some trade-offs here. Depending where you are, you may want to try different ones for different purposes, right? But these are all these multi-pulses that are kind of in that sweet spot of providing some grain, some leaves often, not pigeon pea, but some of the other ones, lab, nice high protein leaves, and climbing bean as well. So many of these are perennials or semi-perennials. Farmers sometimes manage them by red tuning and grow them for 2 or 3 crop years. But we tend to have recommendations, tend to treat them as an annual, so we may be looking and seeing if farmers are treating them more as a perennial in that environment. So again, there's this intrinsic trade-off. Crop diversity, I think we need what we call C4 grasses that grow super fast, but then they tend to be low nutrition. They almost have to be. And they tend to require a lot of fertilizer. Then we have C3 grasses like rice, then we have legumes, and then again this multi-pulse that provides high nutrient tissues, so the biomass is high quality, but it tends to grow slowly at first, which means weeds can come in. So it's a good intercrop because it grows slowly. So this is a trade-off. So I'm not saying any of these are better than others. Like I would love to see more sorghums and millets in certain places. but we also need to think about farmers grow these so-called C4 grasses for a reason, yeah? Because they grow so fast, get above weeds, easy to grow relatively, so a lot of calories, very important. And often markets are set up to be able to always sell them. So one way to get around this sort of trade-off and make sure we can get both a win-win is to grow a corn or a sorghum, a C4 grass, plus a multi-pulse. So we have some of both worlds. And of course, you know this intercrop of pigeon pea, which grows very slowly at first. In fact, almost every year, I think the pigeon pea is not going to make it this year. It goes so slowly at first. But it's putting out a massive root system, right? So it has to go slowly above ground at first. Then eventually, when you harvest the maize, it starts to pod and produce, and in fact, farmers have even selected varieties that pod at the right time. So you don't have as many insect issues if it pods when it's still raining. So local adaptation of pigeon pea is very important. I've always used modern varieties, as Neil pointed out. I call them modern because they're not always improved for different circumstances. But recently in Malawi, there's Mutunjuni, run away from June. So kind of a very relatively medium duration pigeon pea that's taking off like wildfire throughout Malawi. Because it has some insect tolerance, because it's well adapted, it's harvested at just the right time. So finding locally adapted material, very important. So in Malawi, we've been experimenting with this groundnut understory. It looks very messy, and it is difficult, it can be challenging to weed and harvest, but it provides a unique advantage in that you have 2 legumes there. So they provide different types of quality. So again, we're getting that mixture of qualities. We're getting 2 food sources. So in Malawi, people have very small land holdings, extraordinarily small, half a hectare or less. And they're trying to feed their families. So you can't really take away maize for too much of their ground, but if they can grow 2 food crops, then maybe you can let them rest the soil and grow 2 legumes for a little while. Again, after the groundnut's harvested, then you see the pigeon pea comes on. And so here's a close-up of it. So you can see how pigeon pea eventually becomes almost a bush. This is in the first year, second year even bigger if you ratoon it. And you can still getting a good groundnut, probably because in some circumstances it may be actually not competing as much for moisture because of an ability to lift some water, we think. In some circumstances it's been shown, depending on the soil type. You can see all the nice residues there. It drops them in the field, unlike soybeans where you tend to take them, or common bean, you take it back to the house, so you lose that. So we tried to look at trade-offs, and it's a simple way to share with farmers and with extension and even policymakers that there are reasons people grow maize with fertilizer. In Malawi, there's subsidized fertilizer, and maize yields are shown up here. This is a radar chart, so you're kind of seeing a lot of things at once. Instead of just looking at yields, we can look at other things. If you want legumes, then a rotation is one of the best ways to get a lot. I was saying intercrops have certain advantages, but for the high yields, really legume yields come from, this is that groundnut pigeon pea rotated, so in the second year. So there's less maize because we divided by 2 because 1 year you didn't get maize. We're just trying to take into account farmers' realities. On the other hand, we're seeing soil organic matter benefits eventually, months of soil cover. So you can kind of see this system, the double-up legumes has all advantages in this area, but is not maximum maize yield. Also, women, not always, but often prefer these more legume-intensive systems. So let's just talk a bit more about future. And when I think about the future in designing systems, I really come to farmers' input. So this work in Rwanda by Krista Isaacs shows that farmers have a very, not all farmers, but some expert farmers have a very good sense of what varieties are good as intercrops. They even are basically selecting for plant traits that do well in an intercrop. So she asked them about legumes grown in a sole crop, this was beans, and then in an intercrop. And she found that the same varieties, farmers were selecting for different things when they thought about growing that bean with maize and they thought about growing that bean with beans. So basically, I think talking to farmers and really recording what they're saying and listening and discussing together is really, that's my core message on action research. Because cooking qualities are often overlooked in beans. Recently, Karen Seehee, a bean geneticist, and I'm proud to say I'm one of my first PhD students, I somehow produced a plant breeder. She discovered that nobody had systematically looked at thousands of bean varieties. It's called a panel for cooking time. From Tanzania, of all the beans in the world, she found a couple varieties that were very short cooking time. And this is a huge issue for canners in the US, for farmers trying to, especially the women carrying the fuel wood. So producing some varieties that are faster cooking is really, could be a real contribution. So understanding, and this is one of the big challenges with Lab. It takes a long cooking time. So maybe eventually we could cross and bring some of these traits, short cooking time, into Lab. I think we should think, there are real, Lab's very delicious, but it has disadvantages in terms of cooking time. So, and some beans do too. So maybe we could work on that. Another problem with beans, as I said, climbing beans requires very cold areas. Generally, beans prefer cool climate. So we've been looking at, in Kenya, what would happen if you developed a variety, which breeders are working on, that was heat tolerant. So it turns out all the red areas could now become, we predict, we don't know, but we predict you could grow beans there. And you can't currently, if they had 2 degrees more tolerance to heat. So I don't say that then you just go and deploy the bean varieties there. We would then try them, right, with different communities. Obviously, it would be for government to decide that, but this is just a suitability map to give you an idea. So we've also taken the same approach with pigeon bean. So beans are kind of a if you have the right climate and fertile soils for climbing bean, they're in pretty much throughout the region, they are very valued as a food source. Pigeon pea is more challenging because it's not always valued. It's often seen as poverty food. Women will be very interested in it, but sometimes the men will say, well, why are you feeding me this? So learning how to cook it, it has some challenges, so we can't just deploy it everywhere. We have to think about that. So in Malawi, it's grown in the south, but not in the center and north. So we saw it as a really underexploited opportunity. These are the types of systems we were thinking about. The rattooning we weren't even aware of until we started working with farmers. So again, we did some suitability maps, and this purple area, these are where pigeon pea we predicted could be grown, and in fact would be beneficial for maize. So it provides certain benefits in terms of rehabilitating the soil. So it could really fit into that. So USAID funded some of our work, called Africa Rising, this project, working with over 1,000 farmers now at these different sites to try and test out these different technologies. So so this is a test, so wake up again. No, it's not a test, but I did want to get your thoughts for a second. So we often talk about the researcher-farmer continuum. So sometimes we work with farmers, and it's very researcher or development actor controlled. We decide what the farmers should be trying in that area. We bring in moringa or a new type of goat. Sometimes it's very farmer managed. Farmers themselves say, well, I heard about this edible soybean, I want to try it. So it can be a whole continuum, right? And then there's a consultative and collaborative approach. And I'm not saying any of these are right and any of these are wrong. I'm not for participatory just because it's participatory, right? Not for its own sake. But I'm just curious, so how many people are working more, this is as researcher, but on the development actor, like you're coming in with technologies. How many people are brave? I do this. How many people are researcher approach? So a few people. How many people would say they're more consultative? They talk to farmers and then they bring in options. How many people are doing that? So a handful or two. How about collaborative, fully collaborative, where you've got farmers really engaged in assessing things as you go? How many people are collaborative? And then we have the real farmer experimentation, where it's driven by farmers and we're there more to just facilitate what they're doing. Anybody doing that kind of approach? Roland? All right, so I just want you to think about, depending on your objectives, where you are on the continuum. So again, collaborative, more regular interaction, collegial, researcher strengthening farmers. So there's a continuum. I often work on this thing, I think. And wherever you're working, I think the iteration that we heard from Ken Giller, this iterative cycles is important. And do we take enough time to reflect? This is the participatory action research cycle. where you're planning together, you're acting, evaluating varieties, testing things out. And I think the reflection part is what I hope we can do at meetings like this, where we really reflect on, if we have the things we've overlooked, are there things that we want to refine as we go forward. So one of the ways we've done that in my own work is what has come to be called mother and baby trials. I called it central satellite trial design, but that didn't go anywhere. But a farmer in central Malawi came up with, he said, this central trial, it has like everything, 30 different plots maybe, that shows everything, sort of this giant demonstration, but replicated. That's the mother. And then he said, all of these, this shows just a few, but really usually hundreds of farmers trying out things, and even now their own experimental plots. These are the babies. These were the babies learning from the mother. So plant breeders have used this to develop varieties that have really taken off because they meet farmers' needs because farmers get to assess them. But I originally came up with this idea in agronomy because it's very difficult, like this agroforestry system. We could prove this agroforestry, Trifosia intercropped with maize, was profitable. We proved it improved the soil. We proved it had all these advantages, improving maize field yields threefold. But no one was taking it up. So we needed to have farmers not just come and look at it, but actually try it out and give us their comments. And that was the only way that we could actually start to learn about it. So the other thing, hope you take a takeaway, is that somehow documenting. Some people work in a more oral culture, so maybe recording, maybe having farmers develop a drama, or taking recording sheets. Farmers can learn from more business practices of keeping track of performance. Sometimes that's one of the things they get most out of interacting with researchers. So this is just a ranking approach. So there's a pairwise. So you think of farmer variety versus the variety you've introduced, you see which is better. It's like comparing two different, it's very easy to say which is better. It's a little bit hard when you compare two things. Now it's a little bit harder because in the sense that you don't know if there's something not in the room that would be even better, right? But like say Pepsi versus Coke, and you really, farmer wanted Fanta, or orange juice, I guess. So anyways, it is one tool, and there's many, and you'll notice that we also ask a little bit about the farmer. We always want to know gender, the relationship within the family, would probably be a way I'd adjust that more now. Whether the farmer is considered by the numerator an expert or not. These are, I wouldn't say use these exact categories, but just try and think about, because you want to know, did women or perhaps widows, did they have different opinions of your technologies or the ones that we're assessing together than other people, right? So you want to know something about the audience. And then the other thing is that sometimes we just say, wow, climbing bean was 3 times the yield. So wow, it's a wow, it's going to go. But, or yellow, orange-fleshed sweet potato. I always remember it's called orange-fleshed and orange-fleshed, depending where you are. But anyways. So I get a little confused on that one. So that was seen as something that would just go everywhere because it had all sorts of advantages and it was high yielding and high nutrition. But, it had taste issues and just perception issues. So looking at variability and probing to find out why people don't like something, because people often are there with you and collaborating and they want to tell you something that will make you happy. So they're not necessarily going to tell you that they really don't like black beans in that area. And they consider them like chicken shit, like really dislike them. That's some parts of Malawi, just, chicken shit. But most places in Malawi are very polite, and they would just kind of push it a little bit away from them, but say, yeah, it's high yielding, and then they want to talk about something else. So you want to probe and find out what they really like, and what people don't like, because otherwise you're not learning together, right? You're just kind of agreeing that everything's good and moving on. So I think that's important, understanding variation. We also do some surveys to find out what farmers are doing in their own fields, on their baby trials, but other experiments, finding out that people are trying pigeon pea to some extent, but in this case, they really like sole legumes, groundnuts, even a few trying triple legumes. So people try different things, and then you can try and explore them with them. So one of the things, so I said we reflect, but do we ever learn? Or do we just promote double up legumes everywhere? No. We've found that some farmers are using it almost as an agroforestry system. Some of the ones that rejected Trophosia, but they're rattooning this, so the second year they grow a pure pigeon pea like a forest, use it for fuel wood. So some places, the pigeon pea just never incorporated it with groundnuts, but they are willing to grow it with maize. So farmers have different ways they try different spacing, so it's really important to look at what they're actually doing. Are they rattooning it? Are they growing it more as a perennial, or are they growing it more as an annual? And we also found, and this is where I'm coming back to soil health, circling around, and I'll be finishing up here, is that it also really matters your soils, what's going on with the soils. Low fertility soils, no matter what you do, sole cropped or intercrop, pigeon pea is just not producing much nitrogen, so this is biological nitrogen. And you hear in literature between 20 or up to 400. So you think 400 kgs of nitrogen, that's a lot, that's great. But in fact, in many soils, you might be getting closer to 40. So we need to understand these interactions. In a high phosphorus soil, the sole crop pigeon pea produces 150. So enough for a really good maize crop in the next year. But intercrop is suppressed some because remember you're getting maize there every year. So the percentage may be high, but the total amount, as I said earlier. So the soil type does matter. And where are legumes? Where will they grow well? As I said, some legumes, like climbing bean, need a lot of fertility. So recently we've been working with a free app that you can get on your phone today called LampPKS. And what it does is it encourages you to dig holes. Now that may not become the big thing, like some of the other crazes we've had in the past with apps, but I really encourage you to get people to dig holes because we keep sending soils off for analyses. And the soil fertility only takes analyses, chemical analyses or the spectral analysis only take us so far. What's down deep, it might be gravel, might be sand, it might be clay, it matters. So this app helps you dig a pit and helps you hand texture it. So you learn something right then. You can also take pictures with if you have a smartphone, and it'll tell you the color of the soil. And then it'll use that information, it uploads it once you're next to an internet connection again, and it tells you what's likely the type of soil parent material you have. There is big data sets of soil types throughout Africa, but they tend to be very crude, right? Coarse resolution. You know, what might be here in a 2-kilometer grid versus what we know that soils vary from here to that side of the room. So it helps you fine tune what is the actual soils you're dealing with. So it just provides a little more information. Unlike a number of apps that just collect information from you, it provides some back. So we're hoping, and starting in Malawi, to use this app to fine-tune and understand a bit more of this participatory action research. Using the mobile phone, our thought is that eventually we could then connect people in WhatsApp groups or some other way. So if you have a similar soil type, then just like you learn here at this whole Eco symposium, you could be learning more on an ongoing basis. What are other people doing? Well, maybe some people with a compaction layer are using pigeon pea to break that compaction layer, a double-up system, and then they're using fertilizer. So you could find out what they're trying. Are they using buns? Are they using some sort of conservation pits, Zai holes? What is working in their area? Because I really believe that so much of agronomy, we always say it depends. It's local adaptation. So we can't just come up with these, great new wonder crops, even if pigeon pea is one. But generally, we can't just be promoting wonder crops because it depends where you are and what your goals are. So we need to get more information out there and helping people. So this is the traditional way if you wanted to test your soil color, the very expensive Munsell chart, which is okay. And we still look at that sometimes. But with your app, you can now take a picture of the soil and learn a bit more, which I think is quite exciting. So, final thoughts. This I just came up with this morning because I thought, well, let's start some conversations. And I was thinking about a lot of what I heard from Professor Ken Giller, farmers that are linked to markets, they have reasonably good soils, that grain legume rotations with fertilizer, rhizobia, inoculum, manure inputs, they can really go to scale if we make an enabling environment. But when we talk about people that maybe have a striga infestation problem, they're getting very little maize, like the first picture I showed. So they might be a farmer that's very poor and is not linked to market, or they might be a good farmer with good resources, but with having very poor soils. As I said, the soils are getting more degraded in certain parts of Malawi, not everywhere. So maybe they could use a double-up legume to really rehabilitate. Maybe they would use something like Lab. Or maybe they need to grow mucuna for biomass for goat production, or maybe mucuna for mulching for vegetables. So I think that we have different, and this is very simple, just 2 situations, and I'm sure you could come up with 100 in your area, but where you work the most. But I thought I wanted to kind of try and talk about how I never like to really discuss like which is better. It just really depends on your situation. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Now it's time for discussions, questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Is that on? Okay. One of our main goals is to see farmers becoming experimentative, doing, innovative farmers doing their own experiments. And so I'm just curious, do you guys have any data on the farmers that participate in the mother and baby trials, how much they go on in the future to do their own experiments on their own farms? Or have you seen trends at all? Or do you have any advice for us in that?
Wow, that's really inspiring thoughts. I agree that we should be doing more of that, seeing what farmers. We've done some of that, and to be honest, it's very difficult data because it turns out that it was difficult for us to pick up any benefit of our interventions because farmers, at least the criteria we're using, we're experimenting a lot already. So sometimes this idea of laggards, I think, is quite not on. But seeing Carl's hand up. It's also true that many farmers are on the edge of poverty and they just can't do anything. But the ones that are a little, and a little numerate, little literate, I think really we just should sit back and really look at what they're doing in our area before if we come in with storage technologies, we should really look at what storage technologies they're trying before we go and promote a certain one, right? So I think we need to do more of that. And to be honest, we have not picked up that we've been able to improve that capacity, although we think, we know they do better record keeping. Maybe they learn more from it. They have more of a concept of a control, because most farmers don't like controls. They know historically what was here, like they don't want controls. They start to value it a little more if they interact with researchers, but farmers are really innovators.
Thank you for the presentation, and I also work in Malawi, as you know. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned the mother-baby trials, and oftentimes they take place on places like research stations, like Chidzedze. And as some people have said, when you take that to a lead farmer, the lead farmer may have some advantages in soil fertility, such as manure, that sort of thing. How do you get that from the farmers who have those advantages off to those who don't have those soil advantages, which was, I think, quite the problem with something like Difrosia, for example? Thank you.
Wow. So he's saying, how do we move beyond, things that perform very well in a research station, or even at, the chief's house when he has a mother trial, because none of the mother trials I know of are done on research stations anymore, but they are often by a lead farmer that has a bit more resources. So that's a very valid question. And my answer is numbers. Because agronomists don't want to let their technologies go. They want them to look perfect. So they tend to say, okay, we have mother trial, it looks really good, we did the weeding right. Okay, the baby trials, let's make sure that we supervise them and do it right. But when you get to grandbabies, and when you get to 1,000 farmers, they can't do that anymore. So we start to involve other farmers. And of course, we try to do more systematic involvement of not just the farmers that Extension knows. So there's a lot of ways to get around that. But one of my ways is just to involve a lot of people and then try and have different types of involvement so that then we can, at some point, really get to farmers that are not always reached and try and learn from what they're doing. So not maybe the best approach, but it's what we've ended up doing. But trying to get, and one cautionary note, when I first came to Malawi, they were promoting Cassia spectabilis as an intercrop. Does anyone know the problem with that? So it looks very dark green, So it's a legume. So you think, oh, it's an intercrop. It'll provide nitrogen for the maize. Will it? No, it doesn't fit. It's one of these non-fixers. So they were putting a weed, an aggressive weed, right next to maize in the field. So you have to be very careful. It worked on the research station because the organic matter was 3 times what it was. And I have an early paper showing this, that all the research stations in Malawi have been put in very good sites or in very odd sites, low zinc or whatever. They're all not representative. That's not true everywhere. But in Michigan too, I've ended up on farm again because often research stations are not in the same rotations. They have different fertility and lime levels. They're just not represented. So if we want to understand soil interactions, you've got to work on real soils with real farmers and their resource levels. So you got to get working with lots of farmers.
Thank you so very much, Doctor, for a wonderful presentation. My name is Rex Chapota. I come from Malawi, so I will either endorse or not endorse what I've said. But I'm glad to endorse before I ask you a question that you are saying the truth. But my question is concerning issues of digital applications, as I've said. How much are we making sure that these are closer to the farmers than before? Because most of the times we develop these wonderful apps which are still at the more technical scientific level, and they're not being used by the farmers to change their farming systems. And I'm saying this because I also work in the same digital space, and we see this happening now and again. What are we doing different on this app to make sure it's closer to the farmer and it can be used by the farmer as much as we can? Thank you, Doc.
Thank you so much. I'm a huge skeptic of digital. What is that guy? There's the guy who's put together YAP, yet another agricultural app. It takes you to all the agricultural apps that nobody's using. So he's a little sarcastic, that guy. But anyways, he has a point. There's a lot of apps nobody has ever used. But I think we're starting to get to the point where, at least for researchers, now to develop it, I don't think they were able to say, yeah, we're going to help researchers and ag development people do a better job. I don't think donors would pay for that, but it's a first start, right? So our idea is to work with Extension and on our own research, when we have those 1,000 baby trials, to at least understand what the soils are there and help Extension advise people. Because digging a hole is something that, and a few people do have smartphones now in some of these environments, so although it's important to remember that a lot of times one SIM is shared amongst many people, so it may only be a few phone penetrated in that area, but there are a few that have them. And if digging a hole becomes a thing, I'll let you know. I'm willing to try it because we currently are living in this environment where we know very little about our soils. So if there's something that gives information back, I think people will find value of it. It estimates your water holding capacity, for example. Maybe it'll be useless, but we're definitely ready to try.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for your presentation. My name is Ababo Stephen. I come from Uganda. And I have seen from your presentation you have done a lot of work at the research station, but also with farmers. But I would like to know how effective is legumes in control of striga weed, because it is a very, very serious problem, especially for cereal farmers. Thank you.
Wow, you guys are amazing. So I would just say one thing, that none of that was done on research stations. We don't really work on them. We work with researchers from research stations, but on farm. So I heard here quite a lot that legume rotations reduce striga, and I know that people say pigeon pea and torfosia as an intercrop does reduce striga. I'm not convinced yet, and I hope to learn from you, because in our surveys, when we were surveying for 5 years, we've been surveying a set of 600 farmers, and we tried to use some statistics to try and understand which farmers have less striga. So it was more like, this isn't our experimentation, this is just regular farmer practice. Does anything they do? Well, the problem is not many are rotating, but intercrops did not ever in any of our years, unfortunately, except maybe one site, did intercrops reduce striga. So maybe you need a rotation, and then how do you get people to rotate? Even just a simple rotation, not with mucuna, but just groundnuts, is very few people will dedicate much of their land. And they tend to dedicate, this is my sandy groundnut ground, and this is my maize, so they don't rotate. And it's a much smaller area for the legumes. So how we would use that to control striga? Some cases manure seem to be associated with lower striga. Fertilizer can help a maize outgrow it. I know that there's really good suppression in these push-pull systems, because I've seen a lot of that data, but push-pull really in Kenya seems to only work where people have cut and carry dairy. So for dairy farmers, great. There's solid 15 years of slow but steady adoption. That's awesome. And unfortunately, there's like no dairy farmers practically in Malawi. So yeah, I agree with you. Like I look to hear from you. Show me your evidence. I will go and take it to work in Malawi, because we really need to suppress striga. That's one of our huge priorities. Our research is showing me time and again we cannot ignore striga. You can't put fertilizer on a field that has striga and expect anything good.